Today I want to tell you about the super apostles of Corinth and the weakness of St. Paul. This is, of course, coming from today's second reading. Paul first goes to Corinth as part of his journey among the Gentile cities. He is leaving Athens on his way to Corinth. And in Athens, he actually created quite a stir, giving an extraordinary sermon at the Areopagus in Athens. It's a powerful sermon that I invite you to take a look at in the middle of the book of Acts. But Paul leaves Athens and he sets his eyes on Corinth, that great sort of seaside city where all of the people who would be going from one side of the Mediterranean to the other would need to pass through. So it was the kind of place, you know how sailors are when they're on their time off? That's what Corinth was like. The ships would come into Corinth, and all the sailors would unload, and all the stuff on the ships would have to be unloaded, and the ships would be moved. And during that time, the sailors were given their shore leave, and they were given their money, and the town was just full of wildness. It was wild people doing wild things, and it was perhaps exciting to be in, but also there was quite a lot of immorality. This may have been why St. Paul set his eyes on Corinth. He goes to Corinth, he's a tent maker. So Paul goes and he begins to work building tents, the sewing, set tents and putting them together. He meets a couple of other tent makers, talks to them about Christ. They're some of his first believers. He spends the next 18 months in Corinth. During that time in Corinth, Paul is preaching. Paul is teaching. Paul is baptizing. He's talking to them about Christ. He's telling people about the reconciliation they can have with God. And though, lest you think he was preaching with extraordinary power, I need to point out to you that the letter of 1 Corinthians, which he writes as soon as he leaves, so he's there 18 months, he leaves within a year or so, he writes back to them. In the letter of 1 Corinthians, he sort of gives a sense that he always worried the job was too big for him. Have you ever had a job that just felt like it required somebody better than you were? A job that required gifts that were better than the gifts you had, and like no one else was doing it, so your job was to do it, but you always sort of secretly feared that you weren't up to the task. St. Paul gives the sense that this was actually kind of his sense in his heart. We tend to think of Paul as sort of powerful and fiery and strong, but it turns out he was very compassionate. He cried a lot. He told the churches that he was praying for them and that he loved them, and he was always worried that he wasn't going to give them enough. After writing the letter of 1 Corinthians, in which Paul writes to them about all the things they're doing wrong, and if you read 1 Corinthians, it sort of just reads as sort of an episodic, sort of one chapter after another of all the immorality happening in Corinth, in the church, and Paul being absolutely horrified by the whole thing. He would say things like, I can't even believe what you're doing in the church. There's not another church in the world that is doing the kind of things you guys are doing. Stop. This is the character of the letter of 1 Corinthians. However, as Paul is away, a group of new leaders began to move into the Corinthian church. Now remember, Paul wouldn't stay for long. Paul would found a church and go somewhere else, found a church and go on a missionary journey. While he was away, and the Corinthians were having all of these troubles, a new group of leaders, Christian leaders, come into Corinth and try to usurp Paul's power. This is happening between the letter of 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. Later, Paul will write to them and call them super apostles, which by saying that, it's supposed to be ironic, right? He doesn't really mean they're super apostles. He means they think they're super apostles. You get it? They think they're so great. They think they're so amazing. They think they're not just apostles, they're super apostles. These are people who, just like no one in the world could have anything to say about, so they think. And these super apostles come into Corinth and they begin to sow discontent among the people of the church about the leadership of Paul. And they have all sorts of terrible things to say about St. Paul. Now remember how I said Paul was sort of, anxious and sort of worried and was always trying to do the best, but wasn't always sure. These apostles came in with extraordinary confidence. I want you to imagine like Greco-Roman, like when you think of like a senator in Rome, right? People with extraordinary eloquence and like perfect form, right? Who just like look powerful and speak with incredible rhetoric. These were the kind of people who came in. They came in in power, and they started to say, think about Paul. Why are you guys listening to this guy? He's this tiny little guy who doesn't look like anything to the eye. And they start to tear him down. They say, look at him. Remember when he writes powerful letters, but if you take a look at him when he's in the present, what? He looks small. His speech is halting. He's not very eloquent. We are the ones who bring you the true gospel. And they would preach with extraordinary, like, Greek and Roman rhetoric, the kind of things that just, like, made people's ears sing. They would talk about a Jesus they would focus on the power of Christ. Right? Jesus came among us as an extraordinary ruler, as a leader with power. He called people around him. Jesus had perfect posture, right? And he turned and he, like, dashed Pontius Pilate. He dashed Herod. And he took all of his enemies and put them under his feet. Not only were they powerful, they talked about a Jesus who was filled with this kind of a power, who was focused on commanding people and forcing them to change or else die. They also boasted of all of their extraordinary credentials. And lots of people in Corinth started following the super apostles. This is where Paul seems to, we have to now presume, Paul seems to make a surprise appearance where he's furious and has all these sorts of things to say against these people. And then as he goes away, he realizes that he didn't actually make much difference. So he writes to them another letter. Now this is where I'm going to tell you something secret you've never heard of before. There is an actual secret letter contained within 2 Corinthians, which scholars think belongs all by itself. It's 2 Corinthians 10 through 13. And it seems to starts right off the bat with Paul talking all about these super apostles and explaining to them why they shouldn't listen to them. And the whole character of the letter, we're going to call it a letter, it's sometimes called the fool letter. The fool letter. Because Paul constantly refers to himself as a fool. Now I'll say more about this letter, but this letter is the one in which this section happens today. And it seems to be put at the end of 2 Corinthians, because after that letter, he writes a third one to them, which seems to be chapters 1 through 9. So what seems to have happened is they had the 2 Corinthians letter, 1 through 9, and there was an extra space on the scroll. And they said, well, let's take that other letter that he wrote, and let's put that one here at the end. And we'll have two letters on the same scroll. And what happened was, over the course of time, we started thinking they were just one letter, because they were all there in 2 Corinthians. We have this letter from 10 to the beginning of 13. And in this letter, Paul actually, you'd think he would come out and would be like, I'm more powerful than they are, right? Isn't this what happens when you get into a war with someone, a battle, when you get into an argument, and they're fighting you and you're fighting them? The way you win is being more powerful, right? By being more clever. It's not Paul's approach. Paul embraces this role of the fool. He embraces his weakness. He embraces his failures. He embraces his meekness. And he uses the softness of himself as an argument against the super apostles. He says to them, these super apostles, they come to you looking so beautiful and amazing. Gosh, who else comes among us looking super amazing? I don't know. Could it be Satan? Who comes as an angel of light and yet is actually the deceiver? He's like, these people are coming among you and they look so amazing, and actually they're full of deception and they're full of deceit. He says, if anyone preaches to you a different Jesus than I preach to you, or preaches a different gospel than I preach to you, you have to turn away from them. Even if I tell you a different gospel, you should turn away. And what is the gospel? It's the gospel of Jesus who was weak. Jesus who was meek. Jesus who was humble. Jesus who came among us and hung out with weak and humble people. His power was love. Jesus never forced anybody to do anything. Jesus was so humble and meek and set on God's will being done through him. He allowed himself to be put on a cross and to be crucified. And that is the source of power. You see what he's doing? He's taking this image of Christ's own weakness and saying that's how we should be as believers. That's why he ends today's letter by saying, that power is made perfect in weakness. And when I'm weak, then I'm strong. By standing in the place of Christ, by being humble, by being gentle, by spending time with those who are lowly, by not being worried about the world thinking we're great, but simply being great in the heart, even if we look like nothing, that is when the power of God is made perfect. Paul goes on to talk about all the things he's ashamed of. And as we read them, we with the Corinthians, start to realize how really amazing this guy is. How willing he is to suffer for the sake of what truly matters. You'll find this interesting in 2 Corinthians 11 at the end. Paul writes, "But whenever anyone else dares to boast, I will boast the same. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I'm talking like a madman. I'm a better one with far greater labors, with more imprisonments, with countless floggings, often near death. 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I received a stoning. 3 times I was shipwrecked. For a night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from bandits, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers and sisters, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, hungry and thirsty, often without food, cold and naked. And besides other things, I'm under daily pressure because of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble and I am not indignant? If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness." If I must boast, I'll boast of the things that show my weakness. This is when Paul talks about his visions today, which I'm sure the reading caught your attention. It's almost like he's talking about someone else, where he says, I know someone who had extraordinary revelations and was caught up to the 3rd heaven. That's somebody we should boast about. They were brought up into paradise, whether in the body or outside. I'm not even sure, but God knows. That's somebody worthy of attention. But I come to you as somebody talking about my weaknesses. And then he gives away he's talking about himself. Because I didn't want to have you listen to me because of having these amazing revelations that I had. But I wanted you to listen to me based only on the truth of my words. Not because I looked powerful, not because I had great rhetoric, not because I wore the white robes, not because I told you I had a vision once so you should listen, but simply to come among you in weakness and speak words as humble as they might be and allow the power of the words themselves to change you and the power of my love to make the difference to you. He literally goes on in this passage at the end to explain to us that Paul was actually disabled. Did you ever think about Paul this way? He talks about the thorn that was in his flesh that God gave him, and he prayed over and over asking that God would remove it. And God said to him, "My grace is sufficient for you." And God did not take it away. He talks later in the book of Galatians about having a serious eye problem. That he went among the Galatians and actually was so worthless among them, they couldn't do any work and they had to care for him for a very long time. And he goes on to say in Galatians, he's like, if you guys could have, you would have given me your own eyes. But of course we couldn't do that. And it gives us the sense that Paul must have had serious vision issues, perhaps so bad that he couldn't even see or walk or get around very well at some times in his life. It may explain why he's actually, you can always tell he's reciting his speeches to people. And it may also have been why his letters were so powerful, but when people saw him in person, they didn't think much of him. Imagine he shows up and they talk about his body is not impressive and his speech is not impressive, and maybe he's squinting or can hardly see very well, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is our apostle? And yet, who are we talking about 2,000 years later? The names of those super apostles? Nobody has any idea. They came in power, they disappeared in a poof of smoke, and they never made much difference at all. But Paul, by standing in his weakness and letting Christ work through him, is the one that truly had the impact. I say this because I love it. I love teaching you more about the scripture. But I also want to encourage you to embrace weakness when it comes. There is a way to win an argument. The way if you really want to win, it's not to overpower the other person. When you overpower the other person, they go away overpowered, you momentarily feel strong, and the whole thing is left out of balance. Maybe you felt this before. And then you're like, oh gosh, I won the argument. Why do I feel like I lost? Because, there's this whole wake of the thing going on. If you really want to win an argument, race to the bottom. Race to humility. Race to meekness. And speak from your heart. I heard someone say once, don't speak out of anger, speak out of anguish. And this is the same thing. When you speak out of anger, you're getting bigger and trying to overpower. Paul speaks out of anguish. And when you speak out of anguish, people hear your heart. They recognize your experience. They understand your sorrow. They immediately, what's the word? Empathize with your situation. When you talk about how hard it is to experience this, when you talk about how much you care and how much you love and how hard this moment is, suddenly the tears are coming from both sides. That's how you win an argument. By realizing that in our weakness we can be strong when we stand on truth and let the love of God flow through us with its reconciling power. It's what Jesus himself did, and it's what Paul is teaching us today.